The Oversight Committee will come to order. We exist for two fundamental purposes. First, Americans have a right to know the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to the taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. It is our job to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. Today, we are joined for just that purpose. The 2011 report from the GAO identified 81 areas of duplication, overlap, and fragmentation throughout the government. This year, the GAO has identified 51 new areas on top of the 81. Let's make it very clear. We're going the wrong direction, not the right direction. This committee is well known for looking at the party in power, the occupant of the President, and calling strikes and balls. In this case, the President has talked the talk, he hasn't walked the walk. But let it make it very clear here today, he is not the first President to talk about organizational efficiency and at the end of his administration have less of it, not more of it. In fact, this problem began long before President W. Bush, and it will not end until some fundamental changes occur. First of all, Congress is to blame. We create the stovepipes by our very nature. We have divided the Congress along historic lines for authorization and appropriation. That is all well and good to have expertise. But at the end of the day, we do not have a committee on consolidation. We do not have, if you will, a standing Hoover Commission. As a result, fiefdoms build up here in the House that in fact protect redundant programs because they're under that authorization or under that cardinalship of appropriations. Secondly, it is clear this President owns these 51 new areas, the 81, many of whom were not dealt with, and ultimately he owns the fact that he asked for reorganizational authority and offered us but a de minimis addition of a 23rd cabinet-level position. We have to think bigger than that. The President and this administration has to be convinced to think much, much larger. Ultimately, real savings, as we will hear today from Mr. Dodaro, will come from major changes in government and how we think. Changes in the House and the Senate, changes in the executive branch. Lastly, if we are to have a 21st century success story of making government as lean as it can be in the delivery of process, we're going to have to call out, and I will in a future hearing, companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Booz Allen, and many, many more that we rely on for government contracting. In fact, this entire hearing could end before we could name the names of all the government contractors America employs, because ultimately those contractors also have a vested interest in the pot of money that they have, or sometimes 4, 5, 6, 10 pots of money to do the same job for different parts of government. As we explore whether in fact government gets a better deal by the same contractor having 5 different contracts, 5 slightly different instructions, producing often different software with different details, or in fact whether contractors need to be part of the solution in having a proactive responsibility to find existing programs at least within their own company and their partnerships. That is just the beginning of the solution. I will, in the days to come, upon conclusion of a number of additional hearings, be calling in no uncertain terms for a Hoover Commission. I will be calling for a thorough reorganization of government. And let me go on record here today. The President's request for reorganization authority is dead on arrival in this committee unless the administration is willing to be much bigger in their thought. If the administration, instead of asking for authority, delivering us virtually no facts, and the facts they deliver showing a very small reorg for the sake of saying there's a reorg, if they're not willing to talk about attacking the very problems we will see here today organizationally, then we have little to talk about. My first question to the Honorable Gene Dodaro will, in fact, be what is the status of the now famous Goldwater-Nichols? What are the failures of it? What are the successes of it? And how can we begin looking at that kind of cross-government thinking in a way that will guarantee, if not next year, at least in years to come, these lists will be smaller to begin with and will have taken care of far more of their past sins. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and Mr. Dodaro, we welcome you back, and I thank GAO for testifying here today. Because our committee's uniquely broad jurisdiction, of that jurisdiction, we have a tremendous opportunity to examine programs across the entire Federal Government. Today, GAO is issuing a report to help us determine the most promising ways to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of these programs. In my opinion, our committee does its best work when we are guided by sincere effort to get more value out of Federal programs on behalf of the American people. I hope we can do that today. For this reason, I hope we steer clear of politically charged rhetoric that condemns the entire government as being obese or bloated. And I hope we honor the millions of Federal workers who do so much for this country on a daily basis. One of the most compelling facts in the GAO report is that Congress has a much worse record than the administration at implementing GAO's recommendations. Last year, GAO identified 176 specific actions that Congress and the executive branch could take to address duplication in government programs and enhance taxpayer revenues. This year, GAO reports that the administration has fully or partially implemented 76% of the recommendations relating to executive branch actions, but Congress has fully or partially implemented only 38% of the recommendations for legislative reform. For example, GAO has reported that oil and gas companies, which are now making the highest profits of any industry in history, currently pay no royalties on some of their leases with the United States government in the Gulf of Mexico. Even Chairman Issa has recognized this problem, estimating in a previous report that this unintended loophole is costing the American people up to $80 billion in foregone revenue. Although Democrats have offered legislation to address this fundamental injustice, House Republicans have repeatedly rejected it. Although it is appropriate to examine the administration's record on these issues, we will also look at our own record right here in Congress. With respect to the recommendations for the executive branch, GAO reports that Federal agencies have taken substantial action to address them. For example, the administration has taken steps to reduce improper payments by the Federal Government. Agencies have also achieved $1.5 billion in savings through the disposal of excess or underutilized Federal buildings, as well as identifying additional saving opportunities. In addition, the President has proposed reorganizing and consolidating a number of our nation's trade agencies into a single department to improve coordination and effectiveness while saving billions of dollars in the process. Of course, GAO's report finds that many challenges still remain. For example, the Departments of Defense and Veterans Affairs need to improve integration of health care and case management to reduce duplication and provide more effective assistance to our service members, particularly as they leave active duty and transition into the VA system. This is something that our National Security Subcommittee has focused in on closely, and I know their efforts will continue. And so I look forward to today's testimony from GAO, as well as the testimony from Senator Coburn, who has also been very active on these issues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cummings, would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Thank you. Thank you to the ranking member and the chairman. When I was a county commissioner, I wrote 8 reports about this, and about government efficiency and what we can do. And it reminded me of something very political, what the President said when he accepted the nomination in Denver. He said in the middle of the speech, and it didn't get a lot of attention, he said, we're not the far right who thinks that government doesn't matter, and we can't be the far left that thinks we can tax and spend our way out of all of our problems, because we need to meet in the middle, streamline and consolidate our government, and make it the most efficient. So to me, that is what both the chairman and the ranking member were alluding to. We can do this on a bipartisan basis by asking ourselves just the following question. What should we do? Who should do it? And how should it be done when we look at any government function? Not because government doesn't matter, but because the mission matters and we can operate it more efficiently. Thank you.
Thank you. Would the ranking member further yield? You brought up in your opening statement, I think it's noteworthy, even though it's a little off subject, the history of the MMS flawed contracts. That is an area in which we've tried to operate on a bipartisan basis. I would offer to the ranking member that if the pieces of legislation that have been offered, most of which that I've seen duplicate ones that were offered and went nowhere under the 2 years or 4 years of Speaker Pelosi, because this problem goes all the way back to the Clinton administration, not to them personally, but to actions of politicos, non-political appointees during that time. If you can, in fact, bring to a committee agreement by the staff that we have a piece of legislation which can pass the contract sanctity test, I'm perfectly happy to hold a hearing on it, and if we can reach that consensus, a markup. It has been vexing to us on both sides. We pushed hard under President Bush to try to get a solution prior to some of these companies being sold and so on. But I stand with the ranking member that this is still an area that if we can find something which we're not simply passing a law that ultimately would be struck down in the court based on the contract sanctity rule, I'm there for you and would love to have a further hearing on it.
With that, I appreciate it. We will work with you to make that happen. As a matter of fact, I welcome the bipartisanship.
I thank the gentleman. And with that, having settled at least $60 to $80 billion worth of past failures right here in 1 minute, we now recognize the Honorable Gene Dodaro, the Comptroller General of the United States, returning here for, I should have it here, about the 5th or 6th time in this role, and of course several times before you had the job. He is accompanied today by Ms. Patricia Dalton, who is Chief Operating Officer of the GAO. Additionally, Ms. Janet St. Laurent, if I spoke French better, I probably could get all the things correct, who is Managing Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at the GAO. I understand that Ms. Dalton and Ms. St. Laurent do not have opening statements, but to make it clear that they could answer questions directly or obviously advise the General, we'll have all of you sworn in. Additionally, an additional witness is expected about halfway through this process, and that would be our friend and colleague on waste control, Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. So with that, would you please rise to take the oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate all three answered in the affirmative. Unlike some of our hearings, we're not taxed for time in the time that you choose to begin the briefing. You're an experienced witness who knows that if the administration, or sorry, if we, the Congress, want you to give a prepared statement, you go ahead and give it. Take as much time as you want. Quite frankly, I'd love to get to questions quickly, but at the same time, this is all about your report and the message you want to deliver to us. The General is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to be here today before the committee, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee, to talk about GAO's body of work on overlap, duplication, and fragmentation in the Federal Government and opportunities to achieve greater efficiencies and effectiveness in government. Our report this year for 2012, like the report last year, touches on many parts of the Federal Government, most civilian major departments and agencies, as well as the Defense Department. In Defense, for example, one of the areas we point out is unmanned aircraft systems, of which the Department plans to spend over $37 billion over the next 4 years to purchase not only aircraft, but payloads, which are operating systems, sensors, etc., as well as ground control stations. Now, we found that the service-centered requirements, rather than an effective overall Department strategy, is causing a great degree of overlap in this effort. For example, the Navy was unable to provide us justification why it was going to develop an aircraft similar to the Air Force Global Hawk aircraft as opposed to buying additional Global Hawk aircrafts. And also the Army and Navy are separately pursuing software for cargo and surveillance technologies that are likely to produce similar requirements going forward. So we've made a number of recommendations to strengthen management of this program. There are huge opportunities for significant savings if the Department can better manage these programs and focus on commonality of requirements and making sure that there's effective management of this program. And this is especially important since in the new defense strategy there's going to be greater reliance on unmanned aircraft systems. We point out in our report the same things are true in the Department's efforts for electronic warfare and also countermeasures for improvised explosive devices. Now, on the civilian front, one good example is in the housing area, which is a new area for this year. We point out there are over 20 different entities managing over 160 different programs, tax expenditures, and other activities to promote home ownership and to provide rental support to Americans. One area that we've singled out this year for consolidation potential is in the areas involving the Agriculture Department and the Housing Department. Now, you have 8 times in 2009, 8 times as many single-family home loans given to distressed, economically distressed rural communities by HUD than you do by agriculture. Conversely, agriculture has given many of its loans near urban areas. In fact, 56% of them in 2009 were given in metropolitan counties. So there's opportunities here. The Administration has a task force they're putting together to look at the housing areas. We're looking more closely at it, but I think that's one area that's very ripe for potential consolidation and streamlining activities. Also, there are many support operations of the Federal Government where there's a need for streamlining and efficiency. For example, we looked at the Department of Defense and Energy and the Department of Homeland Security, looked to see if they had duplicative IT investments. And indeed, we found 37 different areas within Defense and Energy alone that were potentially duplicative IT investments, and those investments represented over $1 billion in funding for those areas. We didn't find any on our own in the Department of Homeland Security, but they found some on their own and saved $41 million and identified other opportunities. There's also opportunities we found in facility security assessments. Agencies were doing their own facility security investments while also paying the Department of Homeland Security Federal Protective Service for doing security assessments that they weren't doing. So there was duplication there. Same thing's true in background investigations for security clearances. We found a number of areas where agencies were standing up on their own case management and adjudication systems rather than a shared common system across the Federal Government so that there was redundancies there and money spent that did not have to be spent. Now, like last year's report, in addition to overlap, duplication, and fragmentation, we highlight additional cost savings opportunities and opportunities for revenue enhancements. For example, in cost savings, there are billions of dollars that could be saved through wider use of information technology to deal with improper payments in the Medicare and Medicaid areas. There's also refinements that could be made in the process by which there are adjustments made to the Medicare Advantage payments based upon the diagnosis given beneficiaries and the differences between their coding systems and the fee-for-service system. We've estimated that could be between $1.2 and $2.7 billion right there. On the revenue enhancement side, we point out many opportunities, such as the potential for selling excess uranium inventories that the Department of Defense have. There are user fees that could be adjusted to be more contemporary for people, international travelers coming into the country, that could take away from the need to use general appropriations to pay for those activities. And there are many opportunities for the Internal Revenue Service to deal with tax enforcement of what's now estimated to be a $385 billion gap between taxes owed under the current system and taxes paid. That's up from $290 billion the last time I appeared before this committee. So we recommend a number of activities in those areas. In addition, we published a separate report, Mr. Chairman, as you alluded to in your statement, about progress, and Representative Cummings, about progress from last year. And we found of the 81 areas, 4 had been fully addressed, 60 had been partially addressed, and 17 had not been addressed. So there are many opportunities. We think collectively, through the opportunities pointed out in our report last year and the new ones this year, there are tens of billions of dollars that can be saved, and more importantly, more effective and streamlined government serving the American people. So I look forward to answering your questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself for a few questions. General, you mentioned what the administration got, what they closed, what they partially addressed. In your estimation, and I say this because one of my predecessors, Mr. Waxman, held a hearing just to ridicule the Bush administration for how many they had been notified to, both IGs and GAO reports, and how many they had closed, and didn't give much credit for the fact that the vast majority of them were from roughly the last year. What would you say was reasonable with any president to have closed, and how many more of these that have been partially acted on, the 60, would you expect to make further progress and be completed the following year? In other words, should we look at a one-year timeline, and I want you to give us the one-year time, but is this a satisfactory direction on these other sub-81 where we're looking, and the final report at the end of 2 or 2.5 years would look different?
Yeah, first, I would say last year's report was an accumulation of issues we identified previously as well. So I think there was more than 1 year opportunity to deal with some of those issues.
You mean you had to reiterate what hadn't been fixed either by this President or his predecessor?
That's correct. Or actions that we'd recommend to the Congress and they hadn't taken action on. So this year we're positing new ones. So the 1 year time frame I would expect would be more reasonable as a benchmark compared to what you were talking about. But I would hope that of the 60 areas that are partially addressed, that many of those areas can be closed within the next year activities. I think it's within the grasp of the administration and the Congress to do that, and I would hope to see progress. I was pleased that the administration required the agencies through their budget submission process to address all the areas that we identified in the reports. So that was a good step, but there needs to be more assertive action, particularly across government. Many of the areas we identified transcend one department and agency, so they really require OMB and the administration to take a very active role in looking at these activities across government.
Well, and I'm going to go back now to my opening statement and what I alluded to. I've looked at the military both before and after Goldwater-Nichols. Before Goldwater-Nichols, as an Army officer, I thought Army, I bled Army, all I really thought about was beat Navy, because we didn't care about those former Army people known as the Air Force. So that changed to a great extent with the requirement for senior officers as part of their career to have joint assignments, very often being trained in another war college or another command and general staff. How is that going? And is it a partial blueprint for a more government-wide system, particularly with civil service? Do we need to cross-pollinate in order to drive down this tendency to stovepipe differences that may be of no purpose other than to facilitate additional cost?
Yeah, that clarification that you mentioned of roles and responsibility and the jointness and rotations and training programs, joint exercises, that part of the Goldwater-Nichols reform has gone very well, in our opinion, made a material difference and greatly improved the ability of the Department to carry out operations. On the side, in terms of the management reforms under Goldwater-Nichols, the requirements part of the process, they introduced some joint processes. That's not going as well. In fact, many of the areas that I mentioned in my opening statement and our reports are because that management of those joint requirements aren't going as effectively as they could be. Now, in terms of the lessons learned, on the jointness, as you point out, I think there are tremendous opportunities to use that in the rest of the Federal Government. In fact, we've pointed out where that could be expanded with the national security agencies to be more effective as well, but also with the civilian agencies. I think it's very important. More and more problems are requiring a number of agencies to work together to resolve those problems, whether we're talking Homeland Security, food safety, or a number of other areas. So I think that's an excellent course to pursue, Mr. Chairman. We'd be happy to support you in your efforts in that arena.
Well, in my final 15 or so seconds, do you also support the idea that reorganization of government would need to be done much more in the Hoover Commission fashion, one in which we start off with a much larger goal, much more jointness, if you will, between executive and to be honest, your organization and a few members of Congress, to set much bigger goals, much longer, for a long-term reorganization, including some of the things you're presenting today?
I think that has tremendous potential, and I'm in favor of that. I think there is really no entity in the Federal Government focused on looking at organizational issues on a continual basis and having strategic planning, being able to look to see if we have the government that we need for the 21st century. And I think having a commission, a Hoover type of commission, is an excellent way to build consensus on that. Because if you're going to have it work effectively, you need consensus. And a commission is a good way to develop consensus and take a broad view of it. And I think looking holistically makes a lot of sense, so you don't have unintended consequences as well. And there's no magic one answer in these areas. You can reorganize a lot of different ways. The Commission could also focus on implementation plans. What we've found, for example, in creating the Department of Homeland Security, and we don't think enough attention was made to the implementation plans in that area, that could be rectified by a Commission.
Thank you. Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, you testified last year about what you consider to be some of the low-hanging fruit in these areas. You talked about actions that could be taken in the short term to generate large payoffs for the Federal Government in the long term. One of these areas was improper payments, where you estimated that the Federal Government might be losing as much as $125 billion. How is the Administration doing on that issue, and have they taken significant steps towards addressing the problem?
The Administration has made, has made that area a priority area. I think they've made some progress. They've collected over $1 billion in overpayments. The estimating process is still going on. There's still numbers of departments and agencies that haven't made estimates yet. They've set ambitious goals. They're focused on it. One of the things that really needs to be done is that There are categories of why the improper payments are being made, and really need to get to root causes. So I think there's progress being made there. There's still many, many issues that need to be resolved. But I think the Administration is focused on it, and I'm pleased with that.
Can you name maybe the top 3 that you know of so far? Is that information available? I know you said not all of the departments. It seems kind of difficult to address the issue if you don't know how much money we're talking about.
Right.
What do you have? I mean, the reasons for $125 billion of improper payments?
Well, half of the payments, the improper payments, are in the Medicare and Medicaid area, and there you have problems in terms of providers that have been found not to be proper providers. So there's an element of fraud in that area. There's systems that have been tried to be put in place. We point out in our report to do post-payment claim reviews, but the Administration hasn't entered all the data in the systems yet from the Medicare program, nor trained people on how to use the technologies to detect those cases. So the health care arena remains a big issue that needs to be grappled with, and it starts with the enrollment of proper providers, to do prepayment screening processes with predictive analytical technologies, to do post-payment claim reviews, to do recoveries of known overpayments. And so we're looking at all phases of that approach to make sure that we're making recommendations that can help guide them as they tackle this very important issue.
Well, as you make these recommendations, are these recommendations ongoing? In
Yes.
other words, so in other words, you don't just come at one point and say, these are the recommendations, then you wait another year, and then these are the recommendations.
Right.
I mean, you're continuously making recommendations?
Yes, yes.
And how is that done? I mean, in other words, are you run into situations where you see a problem, and do you immediately let the Administration know that?
Yes. Once we have confidence that our analysis is complete, yes, we do that. We provide all our reports to the agencies for comment and draft before we finalize them, but we have ongoing dialogue with them, and so we share that on a continual basis.
Can you give us a sense of how many of the proposals put forward by the Administration in the 2013 budget address GAO's issue areas from the 2011 report? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, there are some of them. Unfortunately, the timing of our report was we had to close our field work before the President submitted his budget, so we weren't able to reflect all those in the report. But one we did mention is that the new requirement for the Administration to designate cross-cutting priority goals because of the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act of 2010, they identified 14 cross-cutting goals, many of which touch on the areas in our 2011 report and our 2012 report.
Now, is it also true that the progress made in disposing of excess or underutilized property, I mean, has there been progress there?
Yes, yes. Actually, when I testified before this committee last year on our high-risk list, we mentioned we had narrowed the focus of the high-risk list on real property because they had made some progress in that area. There's also an area where they've submitted a legislative proposal. This committee's acted upon it. The House has. It's pending action in the Senate. So I think there's steady progress being made in that area as well.
Now, so you satisfied with that progress?
Well, you know,
I know it's ongoing. I'm just curious.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that it would be good for legislative action to be taken to be able to deal with some of these barriers that they face in disposing of those real properties. And I think greater progress is possible, and legislative action would provide an additional impetus and give the Administration an additional tool to deal with that area. We're continually doing that. Next year, when we testify before you, we'll have a definitive answer on our high-risk list. But I'm expecting more progress. I think it's possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for joining us today. Just a couple quick questions. Mr. Dodaro, your testimony says that we could potentially save tens of billions of dollars annually. What are the most important areas we should focus on to realize these cost savings?
There's a couple that are really important. I mentioned one in my opening statement in terms of the adjustment process. Congress mandated in the Medicare Advantage portion of the Medicare program, that there be a comparison with the fee-for-service program. There's a greater advantage to people in coding beneficiary diagnoses for Medicare Advantage because they get paid based upon those claims, where fee-for-service programs, the diagnosis isn't as important, if you will, going forward to be as precise. So they make an adjustment to the process. It was 3.41% that was developed because of these coding errors. We think the percentages is higher, and so by refining CMS's process, we think they could save over $1 billion, up to $3 billion, and that's cumulative going forward every year. Also, there's an area of where the Federal Government does not have enough information to offset pensions for Social Security, particularly spousal benefits from people who don't participate in the Social Security program, like State and local employees. The CBO's estimated that could be between $2 and $3 billion in that arena as well. So those are a couple of really good examples that I think could yield very significant savings.
Okay. In addition to cost savings, what are the most important advantages to reducing duplication in government?
Well, I think there are many. I think you save administrative costs, you save program dollars, you can target more efficiently to help people. I think it also, from a citizen perspective, makes it easier to figure out where to go to get services, to get help, and it improves the image and confidence in government that it's operating as efficiently and effectively and on the best interest of the American taxpayers as people believe and have a deserve to right that it does.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate all the work that you're doing. A question for you about the inspectors general. I have some concern about the lack of appointments from the administration. We have vacancies at State Department, DOD, USAID, SIGAR. For a moment, talk about the role that they play, and is there, one of the questions I have is long-term organizationally, how should we move forward? Are they in the best position to actually achieve what they're supposed to achieve, or should we perhaps consider a reorganization? I wonder if maybe they should be part of your organization. Give me your perspective on that, if you would, General.
Yes, I would do that, and I also would like Patricia Dalton to comment on this. She was a Deputy Inspector General at the Labor Department and acting IG there for a year, so she has a unique perspective as well. First, I too am concerned about the vacancies in those areas. It's very important to have somebody there. I know firsthand, I was acting for 2.5 years in this position before I was confirmed. It makes a difference, and it's important to have somebody in there that can provide the right type of leadership. The IGs are well positioned with the proper leadership, and they have the tools and they have the legal authorities to be effective. Many of them carry out important areas. I think it's important for each department and agency to have their own audit investigation shop there. It's hard for us to cover the entire Federal Government, but there are many more resources in the IG community than there is in the GAO. Across government, and so we try to focus on cross-governmental, cross-agency type of issues, which are very important. So I think that if the proper leadership is there and proper staffing, they could be effective, and that needs to be the case across government as well. We work with them very carefully in doing financial audits. They arrange for them of the departments and agencies. We do the consolidated financial statement of the Federal Government. So I try to work effectively with them, but I haven't really thought about reorganization options. I'll give that some additional thought. Pat? Thank you.
One thing I would add is just where they're positioned in their cabinet agencies. I think it's an important and a valuable position in that they are within the departments so that they can see close up what is going on. But the protection for them is that they also report to the Congress. So they do have dual reporting responsibilities, and it's very important that the Inspector Generals take to heart those responsibilities and recognize that they report to the Congress as well as to working within the department. So I think it's very important. There are some protections the way that they're positioned. For example, for their budgets, the Congress also is told exactly what they requested. It's not just what the administration passed through and requested for them. So those are important protections that provide some valuable insights to the Congress just by their position in the agencies, that they can see what's going on within it. And
they also, I might point out, also Congressman Chavez, they have far more investigators to do criminal investigations than we do at the GAO. That's another important difference between our two organizations.
Thank you. My time has expired, but Mr. Chairman, I would hope that these vacancies be a priority for this administration, because to have 4 of these major departments without an IG, one of them the State Department, for more than 3 years, I think is totally unacceptable. It is vital to us to have the proper oversight within these departments. I yield back.
I share with the gentleman that feeling. I would note that your very clever question of should $2 billion worth of funding and 12,000 employees be added to the GAO was an excellent question. The General seemed to have ducked the answer of increasing his organization by that size. With that, we go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If every politician were here who denounced waste, fraud, and abuse, this hearing room would be packed. If the lobbying community took our efforts seriously, the audience would be packed. But I'm afraid what we're seeing here is a lot of political theater, and it's not even very good theater. The GAO has put together an excellent report. We all know in our hearts that very few members of this committee will read it. We may or may not have a new Hoover Commission. But the title of this committee is the Government Oversight and Reform Committee. It's our job to do this. I wish our colleague from the Senate, Senator Coburn, had been able to testify first, because his testimony highlights very clearly this is primarily a congressional responsibility that we have bungled. He also is very useful in reciting a history of almost 100 years of congressional lip service to this problem and very little action. So how do we solve this? There are a lot of excellent examples that have been brought forward in this committee, specific examples dealing with the details of government, which, unless people are personally affected back home, they really don't care much about. They just want the problem solved, and they wonder why we take so long to solve it. So I would like this committee to consider some procedural reforms to encourage us to tackle these problems and take them more seriously. Because today, the political reward system is such that we're primarily benefited if we have good news speech material that excites voters back home, something new and improved. And to be honest with you, most of us don't really care if it's a duplicative program, as long as it sounds good to kids or seniors or veterans or whatever constituency we're appealing to. And it's worked this way in American politics for a long, long time. So how do we change that equation? How do we incent this committee or this body to read the report, to take it to heart, to enact legislation, to curb duplicative programs? What's the reward system in that? In general, you know, the phrase in politics is friends come and go, enemies accumulate. And most folks are worried that there's going to be some group out there, and I remember the pimento lobby was against me at one point. Yes, the little red thing in the olive has its own lobby, and somehow I was labeled as being anti-pimento. I had no idea. I didn't mean to be anti-pimento, but they care deeply about my pimento track record. So there are pimento lobbies all over the country, and they have a constitutional right to lobby. Free speech is a great thing. But we also have to manage this government, and we're doing a terrible job today. So how do we clean house? How do we get rid of obsolete laws? How do we stop duplicative programs? The same old isn't going to do it. We can have all the commissions in the world, and we won't read that new report just like we won't read this report. So, Mr. Chairman, we need to think of ways to get this committee to do its work. I look forward to Senator Coburn's remarks, because he's been one of the national leaders on this topic. Many people in both parties have tried to lead on this, but the same old approach will not do it. So let's put our heads together and think in some bipartisan way of not just blaming the administration, not just thinking that the cure-all for all of Congress's problems will be switching party leadership, because both parties are in cahoots on this, and we've both bungled it. So I would ask the GAO, at least in your spare time, and you already do an excellent job, we need help in creating a different system so that we're not always seeking new speech material, not always new and improved, without caring what's duplicative. In some state legislatures, they've proposed that you can't pass a new law unless you get rid of 2 old ones. That's an interesting approach to it. Maybe if the media paid more attention to our overall record of co-sponsorships, how many folks have, sponsored billions, trillions of new ideas without looking at how much could be reduced. Because government is obese, and we've got to figure out a better solution than the current same old of the blame game. We're great at blaming the administration. We're great at blaming the other party. But that's not getting the job done. That's not solving the problem for folks back home. So I look forward to talking with you, Mr. Chairman, about this and the ranking member. There's got to be a better approach than what we're doing right now.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be delighted.
I couldn't agree with you more that we do have a long history of having hearings and then having a similar hearing a year later. One question you might ask the General, though, is what is he doing to reduce cost at the GAO in light of an 11% cutback in his funding?
Well, the Chairman has already asked the question. Would the General like to respond?
Yeah, well, we've taken an approach to look at a line-by-line item of our budget and scrubbed it to be more efficient in terms of cutting back on our administrative operations and really making sure that they're operating effectively. We're experimenting with more telework in the field to reduce our rental costs by 40%. But unfortunately, all the actions that we've taken in order to improve the efficiency of our operations hasn't been enough to absorb the cuts. So we've had to, since we're an agency of 80% personnel costs, we've had to reduce the number of people at the GAO. This year, we will be 11% smaller, which is about 365 people, which will be the lowest level in GAO staffing since 1935. And so I've been concerned about this. I've testified before the House Appropriations Committee, asked for a partial restoration of the staff support. I believe we have good justification. Our recommendations, many of them are adopted. Many are not, are still in process. But those that have been adopted have returned $81 to the American taxpayer for every dollar invested in GAO. So I look forward to continuing to work with the Congress on this issue.
Great question, Mr. Cooper. With that, we go to Mr. Chaffetz for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to go to one of the sections in here. It talks about the lost revenue, if you will, from the IRS failing to collect some $385 billion. Can you expand on that a little bit? A lot of discussion we have here in Congress is about should we increase taxes, should we cut taxes? And here we have $385 billion. That's an annual number, correct, from 2006, correct?
Right. Yeah, one of the things, Congressman, I'm glad you asked this question. First of all, IRS had not been doing regular estimates of the tax gap, so we had made recommendations to that issue. We had placed administration of the tax laws on our high-risk list many years ago, starting out with fraud and the earned income tax credit, but we expanded it more broadly. There is a lot of underreporting of income in this area, but the first part was to figure out how much and then where is it occurring. And so IRS is continuing now to do active research in all those areas, and GAO is doing a lot of research. Some of the things that we've recommended, for example, have been to have IRS use third-party information more to check against the records. For most wage earners, the taxes are deducted, but for many others, they're not. And so that's an area in real estate, for example, real estate owners, for services that are provided to corporations. There could be third-party reporting. The Joint Committee on Taxation, just from implementing those two recommendations alone, estimates $5.9 billion that could be collected over a 10-year period of time. IRS, we've also recommended that they could perhaps do a better job providing assistance to taxpayers to ensure greater voluntary compliance through automating some of their responses as well. We've had recommended in the past, and now it's being implemented, that paid tax preparers, who many people use, have to have certification and ongoing education requirements as well. So there's really a multifaceted strategy that we've recommended, and we continue to do work in this area to try to do it. We shouldn't ask people to pay more if people currently aren't carrying their share of the burden.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point, Mr. Chairman, that while there's talks about raising taxes again, here we have $385 billion not collected in just one 12-month period, and then you combine that with the tens of billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse. If we want to have an economic impact upon the financial books of this country and our ability to have a government that is limited but also funded in a proper way, these are two things that we cannot ignore, and that's why I'm so excited about this committee and the work that we're doing here. I have just less than 2 minutes here. I wanted to talk about the border security. It's point number 47 in the report. We had spent an unbelievable amount of money on SBI Net, which basically doesn't work. But the Arizona Border Surveillance Technology Plan, you're somewhat critical of that plan. Can you expand verbally on the concerns that you have with the border security initiative that Homeland Security is putting forward?
Yes. We have concerns that it's unclear as to what the benefits are going to achieve and how they're going to measure performance under the program, and also estimating the life cycle costs of these activities. Continually when we look at these technology investments, it's always not quite clear up front exactly what the benefit is that's going to be achieved, how it's going to be achieved, how you're going to measure whether you know that there's success there, and do you have a realistic estimate of how much it's going to cost before you start proceeding down the path and have well-defined requirements. If you don't have those things up front, it's a recipe for disaster later on and a lot of wasted resources and time and energy. And so in this case, we're saying that those things ought to be well-defined up front. The Department agrees, I believe, with our recommendations, and hopefully they'll be able to provide these type of clarifications and additional analysis.
And one thing that I would hope that the GAO would look at is how the statistics are gathered on the border. There's some concern that there has been an adjustment or a change in how those statistics are initially come about. How are we tracking the turnback souths or the getaway categories? Here we're trying to quantify things, which, as you say, having the metrics in place is imperative to coming to a proper decision. So I just encourage you to look at that. My time has expired. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We are looking at that issue right now. We'll have a report soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and congratulations, Mr. Dodaro and your team on this really excellent report. And I'd like to be associated with the comments of my friend, Mr. Cooper. And I'm going to take this home. I'm going to put it by my bed, and I'm going to read it every night before I go to bed. Because let me tell you, I think that saving taxpayers' money and making government work better is a really exciting goal and something that we can both work together on all sides of the aisle to make happen. I understand before I got here there was an agreement on one of your areas that you have highlighted for many years, the loophole for oil and gas companies, that there are literally leases to extract oil and gas from land owned by the American taxpayer, and absolutely nothing is coming in from it. You estimated 21 to 53 billion. I believe the chairman or the Republican report had 80 billion, so certainly whether it's 80 or 53 billion, it's a lot of money. And I'm thrilled that we're going to work together to close that loophole and move forward. That could help our economy and help pay down our deficit. You also talked about management and improving management of oil and gas resources as really an area we need to focus on. And you, based on your report, you said we're not getting a fair return from the leasing of federal land that belongs to U.S. taxpayers. And in fact, you said we were absolutely 93rd in the world, to be exact, in collecting revenue from oil and gas leases. And we are preceded by the only countries doing worse than we are Peru and Pakistan in collecting a greater. That's not a very good record, is it? So we're going to have to work on that. And in your report, you indicate that over the last year, improved management by the Interior of Federal Oil and Gas Resources could result in an additional revenue of $1.8 billion over 10 years. Can you elaborate on what the Interior is doing, what steps we need to take, and could you just point out more information in that area?
Sure. I'm going to ask Ms. Dalton to address that issue. She was responsible for that work.
Okay, great.
Thank you. There's a number of things that Interior can do, and in fact they are starting to do that we've pointed out in our report. One is to gather good data on what actually is coming out of the wells to determine how much is being owed to the Federal Government. It's important to have third-party information and not self-reported information. It's also important to have quality information coming in so that it's verified, again, so that we know exactly what's being owed. I think those are two important things that will assess, will help in determining in the Federal Government receiving exactly what it is.
And Interior is working on this now?
They are working on it. They've made some progress, but there is more to be done. Interior is also working at hiring additional people. They've gone through a reorganization. They need to have the right people and the right skills to do the important work that they're charged to do. One thing Interior has done recently, which we had pointed out in our report, and you mentioned in terms of where the Federal Government is as a resource owner and the amounts that we're charging. Interior has just completed a study of our royalty rates and has made adjustments in those. There's one area that you allude to in terms of non-producing lands. There is a request by the administration to provide an annual rental fee if a lease is not producing, that the leaseor would be required to make a payment based on the acreage leased, which many resource owners do in fact charge. When we did our study, what we were doing was comparing what we in the Federal Government do and the Department of Interior does with other resource owners, whether it's states, other countries, private citizens that own valuable oil and gas resources and other minerals.
Well, my time is almost up. I'd like to ask each of you, you worked hard on this report, if you could recommend one area, just one simple area that's not divisive, that every American could agree on, that even Congress could agree on and work together on to help improve management that would help the bottom line of our country. What would it be? You want to start, Mrs. Dalton?
I think one of the things that I think is most important that crosses all of the areas is having good information on what exactly are we getting. Are we measuring the outcomes that we're receiving? Because then we can start making decisions on how we can be more efficient and more effective.
Mr. De Niro.
I just would like to underline Pat's comments, because the one thing that's really surprised me out of this whole exercise that we've been doing for the past 2 years is how much we do not know about the effectiveness of many of these programs. They may have overlapping responsibilities, but in trying to figure out how to handle this, you really don't have a lot of good information about what we're getting for the value of many of these programs and activities. And I think unless you have that, it's very important. The other thing is I think we've got to get better organized to deal with the problems, according to the comments that were made earlier by the Chairman on this area. I don't think we're organized properly to be able to tackle these problems with the administration or within the Congress, and so I think innovative approaches are required.
And Ms. Laurent?
Thank you. I think both of our reports highlight a number of areas where just better attention to good management practices and good business practices would yield significant benefits. For example, we have several suggestions from last year's report regarding contracting, the need to get better competition in contracting, better manage the use of multiple award contracts, et cetera, or interagency contracts. Also, the efforts that are going on now to consolidate data centers, I think, are very important and have potential for saving significant costs as well. So those are a couple of examples.
Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, good seeing you again. My concern is more when we go to the auto bailouts and we look at there was $62 billion spent, And when we talk about the Auto Recovery Office, part of the Department of Labor, I noticed in item 39, we're talking about an office that spent, I think, roughly last year about $1.2 million in travel expenses, going to communities that were hardest hit by plant closings and the effect that it's going to have. Could you see any positive results from that? But as I read your report, it seems to me that there's a great deal of overlap with that department, and maybe they've missed their mark as far as what they were initially set to do.
Basically, our fundamental point is right on your question. We have asked them to provide justification for what they think that they've done in order to promote effectiveness, because when we went out and talked to communities, many of them got help but pointed to other parts of the Federal Government for that they got assistance from. And so our fundamental question is either for the office to produce some tangible, concrete examples of exactly how they've improved their effectiveness, or those funds could be better spent perhaps going to departments that are providing direct assistance to the communities.
Yeah, because it seems there's an awful lot of duplication there and a lot of just back and forth on things that didn't really accomplish anything. And I'm greatly concerned now because as we talk about the auto bailouts, and I don't think this is a time to take a victory lap. I know, and you know, and after being in the automobile business all my life, I do know that the cost of gasoline does kind of affect what the market is and who can afford to buy a car and what they're going to continue to do. So while we may think we've made some type of a dramatic recovery, and I just looked this past weekend, if you add all the manufacturers' numbers together, you know what they're projecting the SARs for this year? That's the annual sales rate, 16.5 million. Now that's their projections. If you take each one individually, I'm a real skeptic of that ever coming to a reality. But the dramatic impact of that is all of these projections go forward as to what you're going to do as far as production is concerned, how you're going to use your suppliers, what they're going to be asked to provide for you. And we know from that last downturn, and I went through it personally at the time I was an automobile dealer solely, I was not a member of Congress, the market dropped 35 or 40% over a weekend. Now, that also affected, especially in trucks and SUVs, when the price of fuel goes up, those just fall off a cliff. I mean, they absolutely fall. The problem you have is that people owe so much more on that vehicle, they can't even trade it in. There's no way you can bring it back. Now, people say, what the heck is he talking about? What does it have to do with anything? If you're in a community that builds trucks and SUVs, that has a dramatic effect. And I'm more concerned. I know we've done a lot of things that we think are going to ensure somehow a safe landing or some type of a parachute that's going to make it a little bit easier. I see this, what's going on right now, is absolutely it's a harbinger of what's to come. And as much as we may talk about it and have all kinds of studies about what's best for those communities, there's nothing like a strong market and a strong economy. So no matter how many studies we do, and I know that people talk about, we need to have a better ROI on the studies that we do. But the truth of the matter is, the shareholders don't have a vote in this. The stakeholders don't have a vote in this. We just tax them and take their revenue and we decide where to spend it. So as much as we'd like to see it spent better, and I am not one that will stay up all night reading the report. I read some parts of it that are really affect me, but I'll tell you what, you've done a wonderful job on it. I appreciate what you're doing, and I wish we could incorporate much more quickly those ideas that you have and those fixes to it. It would certainly bode well for the stakeholders and shareholders of this business, which are the hardworking American taxpayers. So I thank you for your time. I know that there's a lot of duplication in this office. While it doesn't really hit high on the amount of expenses, this is one of those times where $1.2 million sounds like chump change. But when it comes out of your pocket after working all week, that's a great deal of money. So thanks. Keep up the good work, and we'll try to work with you and get to some answers in this. But thank you, gentlemen.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield? General Dodaro, specifically on the auto bailout effectiveness, I think you've weighed in previously on that. Would you like to give us an update on how successful the funds relocation, the effort has been?
Yeah, there are, and I comment on it both in terms of the automakers, but also other parts of the TARP front. There's still a couple of key issues, and where the story isn't completely written yet. And one is, whether or not Treasury decides when to divest in some of these investments that have been made in the auto companies. AIG, for example, we've made recommendations to make sure that they have the right type of expertise to decide when to divest and how to do it. in order to make sure that the taxpayers are best protected in that area. And I might also, take the opportunity to comment that another large part of the bailout activities is resolving the issues with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that's a big issue. That'll end up being one of the major costs occurred through this financial bailout process.
I thank the gentleman.
Will the gentleman yield? May I ask a question? Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
My time has expired.
On this particular issue, on the TARP. I ask unanimous consent to ask a question on TARP.
If the gentlelady from Washington, D.C. will forego, I'd ask unanimous consent the gentlelady have 30 seconds for a question, without objection.
This is a critical point, and we really need more information on it. We had a bill, a bipartisan bill passed in the last Congress that would have tracked where everything went, and TARP passed our House, overwhelmingly died in the Senate. I think I'd like to request the chairman to request, since I know I don't have the power to request, a report on where we are in TARP. From the GAO, where did all that money go? What's still out there? What are these questions that you sort of lightly touched that we could look at in a better way to figure out how to make smart decisions on what is remaining to be done? And I still am fuzzy on where it was paid back, when, what time, in what form, and I think that would be a really helpful thing for the economy and ways to manage in the future and manage what's right before us right now. I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady, and I will take your request as an order to work with the GAO on bringing that to the full committee. With that, we recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for this report. Actually, I want to suggest one doesn't have to stay up all night reading the report, because that's not how it's organized. It's really organized so that you can go in agency by agency and look at and extract the particular areas where you could really get some bang for whatever buck it is you're looking for. If you believe that government does a great deal of good, as I think the American people really do, you want it managed very well, and every time something comes out about it being poorly managed, there are those who will take advantage of that to say that the whole thing ought to be sent up in smoke. But essentially, Mr. Dodaro, this is a management responsibility. When I chaired the EOC, I reorganized the agency, but I didn't do it just to move the programs from one place to another. It enabled me to go to a settlement strategy, for example, instead of litigating everything. I can see the value of eliminating duplication. In order to do it, I had to reorganize the entire agency. Now, the closest thing we have to eliminating duplication, overlap, et cetera, is the President's proposal on reorganization. So I've got to ask you about that. Because we can talk about it as much as we want to, but it is the administration, it is management that runs the agency. Now, just to take one of the functions, and the President wants to do this in a way just like you have done it. He doesn't do the whole elephant and say, throw it up and let's get it all done. He focuses in on agencies which suggest reorganization would save money. The trade functions, for example, where he says over 10 years you could save $3 billion. You would think Congress would be all over that as much as we want to save funds. But in light of your own report on duplication, I'd be most interested in your opinion of the President's reorganization proposal.
Okay. Of course. First, I would say there are a couple of issues. One is the request for the sort of fast-track authority for the Congress. I think that's a real policy decision that the Congress is going to have to wrestle with.
Why do you think the President did that? Yeah, Congress will always have problems with that. And that's the only way we have to get and get into the struggle in the first place. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, I think the Congress worked with the administration on a reorganization for the Department of Homeland Security. The presidents have requested, but we really haven't had that fast-track authority since President Reagan was given the authority for a brief period of time many years ago.
Did it work for President Reagan?
Well, I don't think they made any proposals through it because it was only given to him for a couple of weeks. So there was a short window of opportunity there. But I mean, there's a real deliberative process, and the question is, one of the things I think needs to be thought about is how Congress needs to engage the administration in the development of these proposals so that there's consensus, so that they work effectively over time. And that applies to any sort of proposal, because if you don't have that consensus, then people start trying to undo the reorganization.
Let me ask you this then, because I'm not here to make the case for fast track.
Yeah, right.
I'm much more interested in his reorganization proposals.
Well, I think there's a couple of issues there that need to be taken into consideration. One would be is exactly what problem they're trying to address. I think the issue about the U.S. trade representative being included in the department is one that has to carefully be considered, and because of the prominence of that position in dealing internationally, and also its special relationship with the Congress and Congress's authorities in the trade areas. Some of the other opportunities for coordination, I think, have merit and should be considered. There are different ways to get coordination, but I think they also have to go into this with the recognition that however they reorganize in the trade areas, because of the wide areas of responsibility, coordination with other departments and agencies will still be important over time. I think there needs to be a good transition plan that has to be talked about up front. I don't think that was given enough consideration for the Department of Homeland Security. So there are a lot of facets of that activity. I think any reorganization proposal has merit to be discussed and deliberated on, and to really to take careful deliberative action is appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady. We are now joined by Senator Colburn. Pursuant to our rules, active members of the House and Senate are not sworn in, so I now take great pleasure in recognizing the gentleman for roughly 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Cummins, and members of the committee. First of all, let me applaud you for having this hearing. What is disappointing is so few members of your body are here, which identifies what the real problem is in Congress. I also want to thank Gene Denaro.
Too many committee assignments, like a markup next door, I'm afraid.
Sure, but the fact is that's called lack of leadership and organization of Congress, so that we pay attention to the things that are really important. I don't know what the markup is, but the fact is the country's drowning in debt. We have a $1.3 trillion deficit. We have totally vanquished opportunity for our kids in the future, and we have brought to us by GAO some things that we as members of Congress on both sides of the aisle can do, and yet not one major thing was done off their report last year, except what Virginia Fox did in terms of consolidating some 35 work and job training programs, which were recommended in last year's study. I would tell the delegate from D.C. that I applaud the administration's proposal. I'm supportive. I'm working with them to try to do it. But I would take issue with the point is we created 82 teacher training programs. The administration didn't. We created 47 different job training programs. We created 56 different financial literacy programs. We created 100+ transportation programs through 7 different agencies. We created 209 different science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education programs. So it is true that the administration is leading and trying to consolidate this, and I applaud them, and I'm going to help them try to move it through the Senate. But the responsibility lies on us, because we, in fact, have created the mess. We have one department in this government that knows all their programs. Only one. The rest of them have no idea all their programs. We can't even get a bill through the Senate that says the agency should give a list of all their programs every year. Nobody on that panel knows all the programs for all those different agencies. Well, if nobody knows, how are we ever going to solve the problem? And we're not unless we as members of Congress take the initiative to start solving it. What I would tell you today is this is a good first start. What Gene Dodaro and his group have done have given us some areas where we can make major changes that not only address the needs that are out there that are not being met now, but can do it in an economical and efficient way and eliminate significant duplication that, by their own report, both last year and this year, says that sometimes actually harms those people that we're trying to help. So I think we have a great opportunity to try to fix things. They've put it on a platter for us, and unfortunately, we've done nothing with it. And given the fact that our country is bankrupt, not going bankrupt, we are bankrupt. If you add all the total unfunded liabilities, we're over $130 trillion. You add $16 trillion worth of debt. There's no way we can fix our country unless we as members of Congress start looking at what we're already doing. The other thing that I would propose that you all ought to pass, we've attempted it twice in the Senate, we got 64 votes once and 60 the second, is have CRS look at every bill before it goes through for a vote to make sure it's not duplicating another program. In other words, to give us the knowledge to say before you pass another bill, are you duplicating something that's already out there so that we don't keep digging the hole deeper? I think those are things we can do. We put forward what we have done the last 7 years in a book called Back in Black. A lot of people won't agree with all that's in it. I understand that. But there's $9 trillion worth of savings in this. If we could come to consensus on $3 or $4 trillion, we could make a significant difference in the outlook and future for our country and our kids. So I would hope that you would look at that at some point in the future and critique it. But we have to come together. I think we've well earned our 15% approval rating for the American people. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I thank the gentleman. And with that, we go to, oddly enough, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford, next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you to be here, and appreciate both testimonies of both of you. I had to slip out for a moment to be able to come back in, but I appreciate that. Let's talk about the why. Dr. Coburn, obviously, you know as a physician very well, you can treat the symptoms all day long, but you got to figure out what's causing it. What's causing all of this duplication? While the GAO report is a terrific report of here are the duplications, are there areas we can back up and fix, and let's prevent it? One of them you've already identified was the CRS reporting. They get the possibility that in advance of a vote, there's already a report out there that says this already exists. Do either of you have ideas to say here's the why of this is why this is occurring?
I think that basically many of these programs start out as well-intentioned perceptions of need, that there's always not a well-documented case for that in the first place, and there's an accumulation over time. I mean, the 100 programs in surface transportation developed over decades, and there's really not a regular process other than congressional oversight to look at whether or not these programs are working effectively. And I think, in some cases, part of our recommendations are to really tie funding to outcomes and not just there's a perception that providing money fixes problems, and that perception is not always.
So you're saying just year after year, Congress has this perception we have a problem, we need to do something. We didn't necessarily evaluate what we did last year. We're really not going to evaluate what we're going to do this year, but we need to go back to the voters and say we did something.
That's definitely part of the issue.
Okay. Dr. Coburn, any other ideas you have on that?
I think careerism has a lot to do with it. Elections have a lot to do with it. I'll just give you a little anecdotal example. 2 years ago in one of my committees, at 2 different times in a 3-month period, bills were brought before the committees that identically duplicated programs that were already running. In private, I suggested to the members bringing forth those bills that maybe they ought to look at what was already being done, and of course when they did, they withdrew the bills. The fact is that's an accumulation of poor staff work. But what it really reflects, and if you look at, we've actually documented the amount of oversight hearings. It's gone precipitously down. in Congress over the last 20 years. The number of oversight hearings has gone precipitously down. We, as members of Congress, don't know what's going on. And in our desire to please and to meet compassionately a need, we do try to act. But we act without knowledge because we haven't done the oversight. And when treating a pneumonia by treating the fever and the cough and not ever giving an antibiotic doesn't cure a pneumonia. Matter of fact, it leads ultimately to sepsis and death. But that's what we do all the time. And so what I think we lack is leadership, both in the Senate on both sides of the aisle and in the House on both sides of the aisle. Because if we're to get out of this, leadership ought to say every committee is going to do the oversight of every program over the next 2 years. You're going to look at what they're doing, how they're doing it, how effective it is, which ones you can measure. The one key thing that GAO is saying, we don't have any metrics on any of this.
Right.
We're looking at all the job training programs in Oklahoma. I've had 8 field reps doing this for a year until they finally discovered we were looking at it. Now the administration won't cooperate. And we're going to be issuing a report. And here's what the summary of the report is on job training programs in Oklahoma. Job training money from Washington is spent to keep the people employed in job training working, not train people for new jobs in Oklahoma. That's my consensus of what's happening in job training. It's the most fragmented, illogical, stupid system I've ever seen in my life. Some areas work well on one program. The same program doesn't work well in another county. And the fact is we've created that mess. And in the background of that, what we've done is created a constituency of those that work in the job training program that value it but have no metrics to prove that they're effective in what they were assigned to do.
The Taxpayer Right to Know Act that you mentioned in the Senate, basically asking every agency to define all the programs. Why is that stalling? Well, what's the key thing that we can get out of that when it's said and done? And it's not blaming the Senate on it, but saying just simply identifying, here are the agencies, identify all of your programs that you have.
The Department of Education puts out every year a list of all their programs. They're the only one that knows all their programs. And the book's this thick. It's difficult for them to keep up with it. But the fact is before you can fix anything, you got to know what the problem is, and you got to know the extent of it. We have great help from GAO, but not to the extent that we need. If just a little history for a second. Gene's predecessor didn't want to do what I asked to do in terms of bringing these bills forward, because these studies forward. When I asked the GAO to give me every program in the Federal Government, they said it's impossible. I went to CRS and they said it's impossible. So we made mandate. We're 2/3 through this. Is that right, Gene? So we're 2/3 through this. So this is a 3-year program. By the end of next year, we will have looked at the GAO will have looked at all of the Federal Government. The fact is even for GAO, this has been a humongous task to get their hands around it. And they still don't really have their hands around it. What they're doing is identifying components of it. We have the power as members of Congress to do the oversight on each one of these programs if, in fact, we'll invest the time in it to find out. Because if our goal is really to help American people with these programs, we ought to be making sure that they're actually doing what they're intended to do. And I would put forth that 50 to 60% of them don't come close to any of the marks that we intended when we wrote the legislation that set them up in the first place.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Senator Coburn and other panelists for being here today. And I want to thank the Chairman for having this hearing. Let me begin with the piggyback question of the Chairman to our friend Mr. Cooper from Tennessee, which the inference of which, if I draw it correctly, I actually agree with the Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, you were asked, how are you doing in implementing an 11% cut to your agency? And one of the things you cited in response to the Chairman's question was, if I heard you correctly, an 81-to-1 ratio of savings for dollar invested. Could you expand just a little bit of that? And I particularly want Senator Coburn to be able to hear that as well.
Yes. What we do is we track implementation of our recommendations by the agencies and by the Congress, and we get third-party estimates of what the financial benefits were as a result of implementing our recommendations, and we regularly report that over time. And so, but the concern that I've had is that on average, over the past 4 years, we've been averaging $91 for every $1 invested in GAO. And this past year was 81, and the 11% reduction is of concern to me, because I think that we're missing opportunities to identify additional areas for the Congress to take even more actions on our recommendations.
You know, I was listening to Senator Coburn, and as somebody who helped run a big local government, it was music to my ears what you were enumerating in terms of let's move beyond the aspirational when we pass legislation and look at efficacy. And can we do that in a non-ideological context? Because if we could remove sort of the incendiary agendas on each side and actually just look at the merits, there'd be a lot of common ground around here if we could get that done. But I would suggest to the good senator that the problem is trust is so badly broken here, and so often we yield to the temptation actively for trying to get somebody politically that you burn trust on one side or the other on the actual task at hand. And if we could somehow detoxify some of the oversight we do in this Congress, I think we could find a lot more common ground. And you made the point, and so did you, General, that here we are a year later, and frankly, we haven't done much with the earlier report. And a lot of the recommendations you reported to us a year ago are recommendations you're reporting to us again, and it's Congress that hasn't acted. Senator.
Well, I think the problem is not partisanship. I think the problem is elections. And I think it's the lack of courage and character in members of Congress. They look more towards fixing their party and themselves, and I'm talking both sides of the aisle, for the next election than they do the long-term interests of the country. And I don't think we've had a problem here. All you got to do is look at our spending. Republicans and Democrats, whether Democrats have been in control or Republicans have been in control, doesn't matter who the president is. We've doubled the size of the federal government in the last 11 years. So the problem is we get along too well when it comes to spending money we don't have on things we don't absolutely need. I would also like to comment, I think what the budget ramifications for the GAO were obscene. When we cut them more than we cut ourselves, when they're the #1 tool. If you want to find out something important in this government and you want the facts to back it up, the last place you ought to be cutting is the GAO. And yet our appropriators on both sides of the aisle really was payback. I'll make that claim. It was payback. They were embarrassed because they haven't done their job on oversight. And here GAO actually shows what's going on and the lack of effectiveness of appropriation, whether it's Democrat or Republican running it. They failed to do their job in terms of oversight, and they're embarrassing them. And so what happens is their budget gets cut because they're actually showing things that they should have discovered with their own oversight here.
And in the 39 seconds I have left, Senator, and I agree with you, I just think it's very important that we move beyond the mindless narrative that government's just big, bloated, and fat, and we should cut it all, and differentiate between an invested dollar that has a return on it, such as a dollar invested in GAO. If we really are serious about debt reduction, here is a vehicle for trying to get at savings. I mean, if it's 91 to 1, there aren't many other federal programs where we can claim that kind of return. And it just seems to me, I completely agree with the Senator, it is penny wise and pound foolish to disinvest in the GAO. And with that, of course, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I'm sitting here, we've pretty much knocked half the deficit off the board just in our conversations with Senator Coburn's $100 million estimate in duplication and the IRS not collecting, almost well over $300 billion a year. Of course, we can get around. You can't get blood from a turnip with the IRS, but I mean we're about halfway there already. And so we talk about what a struggle it is to get it under control. I'm not sure it's that big of trouble if we just do our job. I did want to follow up on a question Mr. Langford had about, what did you think the causes for this were? And I'm wondering if part of it also isn't the committee structure within Congress, in that everybody, I think, would agree jobs are the biggest issue, so every committee wants to create a program to create jobs or to create training for jobs. I do think we have a unique opportunity with the broad jurisdiction of this committee to come up with overviewing all of these programs and coming up with recommendations that go through even the existing committee structure to do away with that. Senator Coburn, would you like to comment on that?
I'm probably not still familiar enough with the House's committee structure to be able to comment on it. I think this is a nature problem of politicians. You want to be liked, you want to do the right thing, but it also has to do with an underlying tenet is we're on too many committees. We're not really good at any one thing. We're fair at a lot of things. Most of us don't go to doctors that are that way. We want to go to a doctor that's really good. And so I just think, this report, whether you agree with it or not, is based on 47 oversight hearings that I did in the Senate in 2 years. 47. That was more than the whole Senate did combined with every other committee. And the recommendations of this are based on facts from GAO, IG, OMB, and CRS. So you can agree with it or not, but the fact is if you agreed with a third of it, we could be $3 trillion over the next 10 years less.
Thank you, Senator. And I want to go back to the GAO report. One of my colleagues suggested setting it by her bedside table for reading. I'm going to take it with me to my town halls, get everybody to scan the QR code on here and actually have access to the report, because I think it's something the American people need to know, and they need to pressure us.
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes.
Knowing how tech savvy you are, we have now received the digital version of that for you to take on the plane.
All right. I'll download it to my iPad. I did want to touch real quickly in the short time remaining. One of the big issues in South Texas is issues with the VA. I think Section 15 of the report deals with the VA and their some of the problems they have both communicating within their own organization and with the DOD for veterans coming out. I know there's one instance mentioned in the report where there are 5 case managers working on the same life insurance plan for one single individual. And one of the complaints I hear both from veterans who are trying to get the services that we promised them and that we owed them is it takes the VA forever to get anything done. The VA in my neck of the woods is months behind in paying doctors who have treated our veterans, in some cases close to a year behind in paying. With respect to the VA, can you comment, is it a technology problem? Is it just a tech phobia where they need to deal with technology? Is it a cultural issue? How do we fix what I think one of the most critical problems we have?
I think there are a number of facets to it. One is it's a large decentralized department, and it needs more centralized direction and management. We've looked at their applications of technology over time and have had a lot of critiques that they need to improve their ability to be able to do it. Some of the procedures need to be streamlined. I mean, one of the classic cases where they have difficulties is in handling disability claims. And then there's an appeal process beyond that that could go on for a period of time. The coordination issues between DOD and VA can be greatly improved in electronic records and how they purchase drugs, and there's a lot of opportunities for savings. But some of the fundamental problems, I think, are cultural, not having applications of technology, and to have more centralized leadership.
I look forward to working with you all on that. I see my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. We now go to my friend and colleague from Cleveland, Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel and welcome Senator Coburn, who I had the privilege of serving with in the House. Senator, you published what you called a waste book, I think it was in December, where you listed what you believe are the 100 most wasteful and low priority government spending programs in 2011. And in light of developments in this country with respect to oil and gas, where they're making record profits, do you think that these industries should continue to be rewarded with tax breaks and other benefits? The argument that there's been an argument that if you take away some of the breaks would affect gas prices, contradicted by this tremendous profits these companies are making. And the top 5 companies alone earned over $30 billion in profits in one quarter. And the American people are wondering, how can this be? And what about these breaks that they're getting? They certainly seem to qualify as a prosperous industry. And I would just like your comments on that.
Yeah. First of all, it's important to note that they get no tax credits. They get accelerated depreciation through intangible drilling costs. I think you have to look at it in 2 different groups. The very large oil companies, integrated, they could probably do fine without the intangible drilling costs. What happens with those programs is they actually pay the same amount of taxes. They just don't, it's delayed. So the cost to the government is the time value of money, which is 0 right now. So it really doesn't cost us anything. I would also note that their average income tax that they pay is 41%. That's the big 5. That's what they paid last year, which is a good source for us and far above what the average tax increase is. I would be amenable to working on that. I think tax reform is something that we need to do. I think we need to have a tax program that we quit picking winners and losers in.
The Department of Energy had a report called Cuts, Oil and Gas Company Tax Preferences. There were 8 proposals, one which has to do with repealing the expensing of the intangible drilling cost. Yeah. And it seems that there would be a considerable amount of money that would be recovered by the Federal Government if they repealed that particular benefit, which I think is.
Congressman, that is true in the short term, but that is not true over a 7-year period. There will be exactly the same amount of revenues going to the Federal Government.
Well, on this one, I'd be happy to provide you with what I'm looking at here. It says that from 2013 to 2022, a repeal the expensing of the intangible drilling costs would be worth about $13.9 billion. I'd be happy to show this to you to see if you.
And again, that's the Department of Energy's numbers. If you go and look at CBO's numbers or OMB's numbers or CRS's numbers, I think they'll show you something different than that. The fact is the average life of most of these wells is about.
Well, I wanted to make sure that I.
I'll be happy to look at it
correctly. This is the President's budget that I'm citing from the Department of Energy, under the Department of Energy. So. In the President's budget, it also says that repeal the percentage of depletion for oil and natural gas wells would be another $11.4 billion from if you repealed it from the 2013 to 2022, and repealing the domestic manufacturing tax deduction for oil and natural gas companies over that same period of time would be worth $11.6 billion. And I wanted to point that out to you.
Okay, the third one, though, is you're going to treat oil and gas different than you do every other manufacturer if you decide to do that. So I don't have any problem with a philosophical difference. What I will tell you, over a 10-year period of time, if in fact, as an accountant, that's my first degree. As an accountant, if you amortize an expense over a period of time versus taking it all up front, the only thing that's going to happen is we will collect more dollars up front. I agree with you. Over the long period of time, we won't collect more dollars. But what you will do is for the lower capitalized oil and gas industry, the ones that are actually finding all the natural gas now, the smaller companies, what you'll do is you'll limit their capital availability and you'll limit our exploration for oil and gas in this.
Well, I can understand the sympathy that you have, and you represent the smaller developers very well. But my question is, back home in Cleveland, I have people who are looking at $4 or $5 a gallon for gas, and they're wondering why are these oil companies getting these breaks, and the biggest breaks go to the biggest companies.
Well, I think you would be better off addressing the speculation in the commodity markets rather than try to right now there's greater supply than there is demand for oil. What's happening? There's an international worry about Iran. which is a significant factor. We can eliminate speculation in this country, but you can't eliminate speculation worldwide. So the most important thing we can do if we want to address that $4 to $5 a gallon gasoline is make sure we have a domestic supply of energy, which we're capable of doing over the next 10 to 12 years in this country, that will make us impervious to the impression and vulnerability of Middle Eastern oil.
Mr. Chairman, my times have expired, but could I ask the witness, with unanimous consent, just ask the witness a follow-up question? I appreciate that. Thank you for the members of the panel here. Could you tell us how much the speculation in commodity markets, do you have any idea what kind of a factor that would be in driving up the price of oil domestically?
It would be a guess. It's an educated guess, but I would imagine we have $15 to $18 worth of speculation in the price of oil. You've seen oil go
per barrel, you're saying?
Per barrel, right now.
This is, Mr. Chairman, you know, this, and I know Senator Coburn is one of the most fluent people on these issues, and I appreciate your presence here for that reason. This may be something that we want to look a little bit more closely at. I want to thank you for that, because $15 to $18 a barrel, and so would that be, what are we at right now? It's over $100 a barrel. We're like, pardon?
$109.
$109. So that's quite significant. That's something worth looking at. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. Thank you, Senator Coburn.
I thank the gentleman. I'll quickly recognize myself for a number of things. And Senator, first of all, we've had a rash of your colleagues coming over here and not only giving testimony but taking questions. So please tell your colleagues it actually is a good thing. I'm just going to quickly go through some numbers. Number of hearings held by this committee, starting with Mr. Davis, 2003, 145. 2000. These happen to be the first year of each Congress. 2005, 135, downward trend. Waxman, his 2-year period, the first year, 112. Towns, his 2-year period, first year, 93. ISA, his first year, 122. I'm not back to where we were under Chairman Davis, but we're heading in the right direction. Number of letters, which are our minor hearings, if you will, under Mr. Towns, 122. Last year, under this committee, 748. We take seriously your point that we haven't been doing enough oversight. It has been on a downward trend.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Of course.
I think this committee does a great job, whether it's led by a Democrat or a Republican. It has a great history, just like the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation in the Senate. The problem is not the Oversight Committee. The problem is every other committee in Congress that isn't doing their job, that doesn't know what they're doing, is not looking at what the agencies are doing, and is not looking to see if what they planned in terms of legislation is actually being carried out. So it's not the oversight committees that I have a problem with. It's the fact that every other committee is failing to live up to what is required of them, which is to know what they're doing, and they don't.
I appreciate that, and certainly this committee has begun looking at the permanent committee or permanent select committee over in the Senate under McClellan, under both Republicans and Democrats, for the work that they've done back in the 50s. General Dodaro, a couple of quick things. First of all, thank you for delivering this in advance in paper, but digitally. In your estimation, from audits that you've done, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that every cabinet position should be able to deliver the vast majority of discovery or requests for FOIA in digital format? Meaning, is there any longer a reason for either a FOIA request or a congressional request, subpoena or not, to expect boxes of paper to arrive? I know Senator Coburn sees them arrive in his committee just as I do. In other words, we paid for a lot of computers, and it seems like we get paper that was printed out of computers in response to discovery, and so do FOIA requests by the press.
Yeah, the consulting with our expert in this area informs me there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to receive virtually everything electronically.
Which would save money, because both on the sending and, of course, on the receiving, the data mining afterwards.
That's correct.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator.
Just to know, we spend $38 billion a year on IT. of which $20 billion is wasted every year. Where's our oversight of that? The number one programs at risk that they have, the vast majority of them, other than some defense contracting, are IT programs. That's where we ought to be. If you want to save money, let's start buying some off-the-shelf programs and make us adjust to them rather than us design every new program. Just like CMS just spent $77 million on a program that's not effective in terms of predictive payments.
Thank you. Mr. Dodaro, you also referenced, I think indirectly, the work of the Recovery Board when you were talking about the potentials for recovery if we changed our systems, if you will, for how we tracked payments by both the payer and the recipient, and also the kind of predictive modeling that I think pretty much you're looking at the Recovery Board as the model for what we should be doing in Medicare, Medicaid fraud and mispayments.
Yeah, earlier I was talking about recovery auditing that's done after the fact, but as it relates to the Recovery Board, I think that their operations are very good. I was over there recently for an update on their Recovery Operations Center. I think there are additional databases that they could get access to. I'm going to try to do what I can to help them.
And if you give us a list, we will do what we can to open those up.
And some of that may need some legislation, Mr. Chairman. But I think that they've done a marvelous job, and I hope that there's ways to find out how to make their operations more permanent once their temporary authority expires. I know you have legislation to do that, and we're supportive of that.
And I'm going to submit this one for the record. We have a whistleblower, a series of whistleblowers who came in essentially making a claim that the Department of Defense routinely hires contractors and or uniformed personnel while not getting rid of or reassigning DOD civilians simply because the DOD civilians tend to be inflexible and they can grab a contractor or some uniformed personnel to get something done quickly rather than later. And so I'm submitting that for the record because I don't want a full study, but I'd like your observations calling on personnel that are particularly familiar with that, because it seems like an area that we may want to follow up on, but I don't want to do it without your comments.
Yes. Let me ask Janet the comment on it. She's in charge of our defense work.
Well, the one comment I would make initially is that the number of contractors, of course, associated with headquarters functions in many entities of the Department of Defense has increased, and DODs does not have a very good handle on that data. So then it makes it very difficult for them to make informed and decisions that also understand and reflect the cost implications of those decisions as they're deciding whether or not to staff positions with a government employee or a contractor. So it's an area we've done a lot of work on, and we'd be happy to provide additional information.
I appreciate that. And I'm just going to ask one more because the Senator's here. This committee has continued to sort of have this nagging proposal of simply scrapping the Department of Veterans Affairs, making it effectively part of DOD, making the uniform relationship from the day you raise your right hand to the day you're buried at a military funeral a single responsibility. Obviously, the major portion of a major portion is health care, a situation in which I know you've done many reports showing us that essentially we still keep talking about having a single interoperable database and never get there, so that a veteran might be treated or an active duty person may be treated without knowledge of other work done or other susceptibilities or problems. And I know the Senator also has unique expertise in that, so any comments you would have on that?
I'm not sure I want to add anything to the Defense Department with the significant problems that it has today. That does not deny the fact that the VA has problems. Look, what we ought to be doing for our veterans, we promise them health care. Give them a card. They want to go to the VA hospital, let them go to the VA hospital. But give them a card to go wherever they want. That's real health care. Give them the ability to seek the health care they want rather than limit what they can have. You can do that in a very cost-effective way that would give them better outcomes, better availability, and better timeliness for their care. That's what we should be doing for our veterans. Let them decide where they want to go. Don't funnel them into some place that we say they're going to go. Give them the freedom that they fought for.
Thank you. Mr. Darrow. And by the way, when I say scrap and consolidate, you can go either direction. You can take all of healthcare and DOD and make it a single system that's led by VA, which is actually some of the suggestions we've had.
Yeah, I share the Senator's concern about adding anything to the Department. I think there's much more that could be done with the current relationship if there was proper leadership and a will to make it happen, particularly in the electronic records area and in looking at joint purchases for pharmacy issues and dealing with healthcare issues. There may be organizational ways to get there differently, and we should be open to those. There's always, we should look for better ways. But I just think that there's many opportunities that could be focused on right now that we could get quicker action on than, as well as looking for longer-term reforms and of an organizational nature.
Thank you. And I will not open up TRICARE for life because that would take longer than even 2 sessions. Mr. Cummings, do you have another round?
I want to thank you, Senator, for being here. As I listened to your testimony, I concluded that there is not one syllable that you stated that I disagree with. I think the frustrating part about all of this is, you know, there was a song that said, "You got me going in circles." And it seems as if we are going in circles. And I'm trying to figure out how we get off the merry-go-round. To your credit, you've asked Mr. Dodaro and GAO to look at all of this information and gather this information. And I'm just wondering where you see that leading. I guess what you are doing is saying, okay, let me do some, present the information, and it will be so glaring that maybe it will cause the Congress and, you know, to get away from the partisanship or wherever we are in this circle to do something. But where do you see that leading? Because you know what I just have this very this thing about time and how you can go and do things over and over and over again, and you can be talking about the same things 10 years from now. And we have a very limited amount of time to be here. I don't give a damn if it's 30 years or if it's 5 years. And so, I mean, how do you see us getting off of that merry-go-round?
Well, first of all, I think if we don't get off the merry-go-round in the next couple of years, we're going to get off the merry-go-round because the international financial community is going to make us do it. And I'd much rather negotiate with you, Congressman Cummings, than I would the Chinese. I'd rather work with you to solve these problems rather than us working with the Chinese when they start telling us what we'll do and how we'll do it, because that's where we're going. If Willie Sutton were here, he'd rob the bank, and the bank is in duplication. And what's disappointing me, I'm less disappointed with the House than I am the Senate. We've not done one thing in the Senate based on last year's report. Not one single substantive thing. At least the House has brought out of committee a reform of job training program. That's $18.6 billion a year, which we know we can get better job training, match skills better to the needs of both the job offers and those being trained for about half as much money. Well, that's $9 billion. Over 10 years, it's 90. And what Mr. Dodaro and his staff has done is give us another 50 banks to rob. In other words, if we'll just do it. So the real key is leadership, whether it's Speaker Boehner or Leader Reid. If we want to solve, we can solve these problems. We don't have to have a fight with the President. We can actually solve these problems among ourselves if we decide that we're going to solve the fiscal issues of our country. You know, not talk about it in big terms, but talk about it in the detailed terms.
Yeah, I saw this when I saw this when I chaired and the Transportation Committee, chaired the subcommittee on the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Deep Water Project, where we were literally buying boats that did not float. As a matter of fact, they're sitting over in the Baltimore right now in Harbor. And we were buying surveillance systems that covered 180 degrees instead of 360. And we're buying radios, and if they got wet, they didn't work. I mean, I could go on and on. But in a bipartisan way, we were able to straighten that stuff out in about 2 years with no dissenting votes, because folk came together and worked together and resolved it. Now, I must admit, the Coast Guard came kicking and screaming, but in the end, I think they're a better organization because of it. A lot of it had to do with acquisitions. They didn't have people who were qualified to even write the contract. And I'm just some kind of way, and I think the reason why we were able to do that is because everybody kind of came together and said, you know what, we're not going to have this. We're not going to be buying things that we didn't bargain for. We're not going to have equipment that's going to hurt our people. And we're going to buy equipment that our people need to do their job. Everybody came together in a very patriotic way and said, let's do it. Yeah. And how do we get there, though?
Well, again, I really think it's leadership. If you and the chairman of this committee would take 6 or 7 areas, which are real obvious. I mean, when I go around the country or in Oklahoma and I say, you know, there's 82 federal programs designed for teacher training. And they say, what? I mean, nobody with any common sense would think we need 82 different teacher training programs. 82 run by 12 different agencies, not even out of the Department of Education. So if you all would target 7 or 8 areas and have subcommittees of this committee say, okay, we want you all to become experts at this, how do we do it? And then send that information to the actual authorizing committees and then hold them accountable publicly for not fixing it. I think we can do it. The problem is we're fast approaching a time where we're past the tipping point. And we have a couple of years with which we can make critical decisions that we can come together and clean up a lot of this. All of it's well-intentioned. None of this was not well-intentioned. The fact is we just didn't know what we were doing when we were doing it. And we didn't, you know, the other 2 things I think we ought to do is I think we ought to put metrics on anything we pass. That as a requirement of any program, you got to have a metric associated with it to measure its effectiveness. And number 2 is you ought to sunset everything so that forces you into reauthorizing. And when you reauthorize, you're going to have the hearings, which in effect will be oversight hearings, to say whether it ought to be authorized. Did it work? We have tons of programs in this country that are well-meaning that don't help people, and some of them actually hurt people. And yet we haven't come together, bipartisan, to solve it. And, you know, I think going back to leadership, we're all Americans. We're in deep trouble financially. We have a significant problem with jobs. There's 600,000 jobs out there right now waiting in manufacturing, and our job training programs hadn't educated the people for them. 600,000 that could be hired tomorrow. We have 47 job training programs spending almost $19 billion a year, and we didn't meet that need. That tells you there's some real problems. So we can do it as Americans, and that's what we need to focus on because, quite frankly, our survival, our economic survival depends on us getting together.
Just one last question, Mr. Chairman. So does that call, like what you mentioned, the Oklahoma job programs, and I know we could cite all kinds of programs, and like what you just cited, does that call for micromanaging, Senator? In other words, if you're going to have the leadership making sure that each program is doing what it's supposed to do, and I guess there has to be a network of communication, too, so that you don't have, if you do have any kind of duplication, it makes, not duplication, but if you have programs doing similar things, that it makes sense that people are communicating and say, okay, you're doing this piece, you're doing that piece. But it seems like that takes some real, not only leadership, but some getting down in the weeds type leadership.
Well, I think one of the defects with Congress is too often we write bills with very good intentions that actually are pretty good plans, and then we don't instruct the bureaucracy exactly what we intended, and then we let it flower from there. And I think oftentimes we know enough to get really specific about what we intend, and yet we fail to do that. I don't think we need to micromanage anything, but you won't have to micromanage if you take 47 job training programs and convert it to 6 and you say there's going to be a one-stop shop in every federal programs. If we're going to send, then you can go to one place in your state, in every county, and find every job training capability there. You shouldn't have to be bounced from program to program to program. And that's exactly what's happening now. Some programs are highly effective in some states, and some programs, the same program, it doesn't work at all. So it's not about micromanaging. It's about having a clear vision of what we intend with clear instructions of bureaucracy and consolidating programs that do work and taking the best of those that do and making sure everywhere across the country, if it's federal dollars and it's really our role, if it is our role, then making sure those dollars are spent well. That's oversight. Yeah. And putting the parameters on so you have a metric of how many people did you get trained, actually got trained in the job they got. We found people being trained in Oklahoma for jobs that don't exist so they can collect the federal bucks for the job training. Well, that doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We had intended on quitting at 11:30, but if there's any additional brief questions, Ms. Norton.
There's an additional brief question. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps you and Senator and for Mr. Dodaro, it's rare that you have the kind of agreement you've seen certainly in this committee. My own interest is in issues like this is far more on how than what. Because when you say some words like duplication, it's pretty hard for people to raise their hands and be on the side of duplication, and yet it continues. I was intrigued by the candor of the senator when he said, Congress did it, so essentially Congress should undo the damage. And I'm wondering about the symmetry of that, though, Senator. Chairman cites lots of hearings, and exposure is very important. That's one of the tools that Congress does have. When Senator Coburn, though, mentions that it's not partisanship, it's elections, wow, that does suggest that there are structural problems here. And let me just cite the record. When Congress has found something important enough to have to move it, look what it has done. For trade and military matters, we have this notion that any member of Congress hates where you vote up or down. We have military BRAC base realignment, closure commissions. And now we have two bills, two committees here in the House have considered civilian BRAC. One is going to the floor, and we're about to take to the floor the civilian BRAC bill of this committee, which tries to get rid of failure to sell or consolidate federal properties. What else? Here's another example. When we created, and you can have your issues with this creation of the Department of Homeland Security, where we did something really quite extraordinary, which is to bring a lot of agencies together. Look, you had something that was unprecedented. You had a strike on our own soil by foreign parties. There are over 500 members of Congress. Once they get their hands on an issue, they act like their constituents expect them to act. And sometimes that is to protect programs that, in fact, are included in this duplication. I am trying to get out of the quagmire. And I'd like you to speak more deeply on how we could, the administration has thought of something to do. It comes up with these up or down votes. Congress hasn't thought of anything like that to do. And if we are to get from the what to the how, it does seem to me that Senator Coburn's notion, we did it, we should undo it, has to face the notion that Congress seems unwilling to do it, unless somehow we were to do something structural ourselves, just like the administration did something structural to get things done the Congress has not done anything structural, and it continues not to be done. So I would just like to press you on, I accept entirely what you say about oversight. I even believe that exposure works, certainly on many issues. But I'd like to press you on whether or not there is something more structural Congress could do that would grab hold of some of this duplication that we all agree is excessive and get rid of it.
Well, this may shock you. I think we can all quit, and they can send real Americans up here to actually do what common sense.
Short of that, Senator. Short of that, Senator.
Well, but the fact is that's what the American people are repulsed by. 85% of them know we're not doing our job. And the fact is we make a political calculation rather than a character calculation about the future of our country. Mr. Dodaro has given 176 recommendations. Specific recommendations Congress can do. What did we do? We did 2 or 3 little bitty ones, nothing major. We didn't make any significant impact on the budget last year. Had we just reformed job training programs, one, we would have met a need in our economy right now that we did not meet. We would have saved $9 billion. How would that have added to your numbers, Mr. Dodaro, in terms of for every dollar spent if we actually did that $9 billion revision and actually got streamlined programs? The fact is we're not, it's not hard. What is hard is every program has a constituency.
Right.
And that constituency, and as I've testified here today, in job training programs is too often those in the program, not those being trained by the program. And so what we have to do is pay attention to what our goal was originally. And when we're more interested in the constituency of a program rather than the benefactors of the program, we're the ones that got it wrong. The American people don't. And what I think is we lack courage and we lack leadership to do what is in the best long-term interest. The final point I'll make is we're short-term thinkers, not long-term. And we have created tons of problems because of that. And that goes to the political side of it as well as the policy side of it. And if we will start thinking in the long term about what's the best right thing we can do for the country right now, what we'll do is we'll be Willie Sutton's. We'll go to the bank. He's given us 176 banks to rob that we can come back on and actually make a big difference, which will actually benefit the very constituencies that the programs were designed to benefit, rather than protect the program, which has no right to be there if, in fact, it's not effective in helping the constituency, the ultimate benefactor.
Thank you. Mr. Conley, you finished? Or gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I find myself in agreement with Senator Coburn. As somebody who ran one of the largest local governments in the United States, to me, metrics are everything. Why do it if you can't measure it? And I go back to this difference between the aspirational and the efficacious. As somebody coming from a local government background here to Congress, what I find is that many people who have spent their entire careers in the legislative branch, either at the state level or here, often think that by passing a bill, they have solved a problem. And it is, as you say, often with the best of intentions. I'll give you 2 examples of bills on a bipartisan basis that passed that nonetheless were almost impossible to implement at the local level. One was No Child Left Behind, which, full of good intentions, full of high aspirations, but very difficult to implement at the local level, and in some cases unintentionally actually do harm. And the other was the immigration reform bill that the previous President, President Bush, actually endorsed, and Ted Kennedy on our side of the aisle actively worked on with the President. Again, full of good intentions, but had it been passed, I believe it would have been impossible to comply with. It was so complicated. I don't know how anyone thought that was going to solve the immigration problem or even be easily implementable. So if we don't have metrics, I think all we can say is it's good intentions, but they may or may not be working. And I completely applaud your point of view. Everything we do should be subject to metrics so that we know whether we're making the effect desired or not.
Just a little point on that. When you put metrics into a bill without teeth, let me tell you what you get. No metrics. And my experience both in the House and the Senate is when you want to put metrics in and put some teeth with it so that they have to come about, you never get it. And so I agree with you, but unless you put a consequence to not developing the metrics on the bureaucracy, you will not get the metrics because they don't want to be measured.
Well, and just a final observation, this committee has had a hearing, for example, take cybersecurity. The metrics we encouraged unwittingly in the legislation was training and awareness of the workforce. So we had a series of hearings where agency after agency said we met the metrics. 80%, 85% of our workforce has been trained in the threat of cybersecurity. Well, the object is to deter cybersecurity attacks. It isn't. That's a means to an end. And so we allowed sort of an easy out in that metric because we picked the wrong metric. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. General Dodaro, Ms. Dalton, Ms. Laurent, you've done a wonderful job. We haven't asked you nearly enough questions, but we've taken a great deal of your time. Senator Colburn, I enjoyed the CPA exchange with the former mayor of Cleveland. I might add for the record that I was in the private sector when, in order to get NAFTA to meet some arithmetic need, they found some current revenue, which was that every small business in America that used to send a check in quarterly or periodically for their taxes was forced to wire transfer in every payroll period their taxes. So the government would get it that few weeks faster one time at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars forever since the 1990s. And yet, just like taking away depreciation until the end when you can write off the whole end of the business cycle, we could score a one-time event. And it would be countless billions of dollars, no question at all. But as you said so rightfully, when the cost of money to the Federal Government is a fraction of 1% right now, taking that money out of the pockets by accelerating a little bit of contribution to the Federal Treasury isn't just penny-wise and pound foolish. It's trillions of dollars foolish to the people who need to amass capital in order to do the kind of work that they don't just do in oil. They do it in oil. They do it in manufacturing. And I would hate to see us do further harm to the legitimate depreciation schedules of everyone who brings wealth to America. So I join with you in the frustration that I don't think you've successfully explained that. I think that some will not yet know that depreciation is in fact real. It's money that is put out today, and you only get a small part of it back over time. And unless you leverage that with debt, which is another problem in business that we encourage, you just don't get the kind of result you want for tax purposes. So hopefully on the Senate side you can continue to try to educate your colleagues. I'll try to do the same. I thank you again. We stand adjourned.